Have you ever wondered why the brightest minds throughout history seem to disappear from society just when their ideas were becoming most powerful? Not because they lost their minds, not because they couldn't handle success, but because they discovered something about human nature that most people refuse to acknowledge. They realized that intelligence and isolation aren't opposites, they're partners. Arthur Schopenhauer, perhaps history's most misunderstood philosopher, spent decades unraveling what he called humanity's greatest deception. He discovered that the very thing we're taught to fear most, being completely alone, is actually the secret to accessing forms of thinking that remain impossible as long as other people are influencing your mind. But here's what makes Schopenhauer's approach to isolation truly disturbing to most people. He didn't withdraw from society because he was broken or bitter. He isolated himself because he was intelligent enough to recognize that human social structures are designed to prevent the kind of deep thinking that leads to uncomfortable truths about reality. Today, we're going to explore something that will challenge everything you believe about success, happiness, and human connection. Schopenhauer discovered that the people who choose isolation aren't avoiding intelligence, they're protecting it. While everyone else is busy networking, collaborating, and seeking approval, the truly intelligent are doing something far more dangerous. They're thinking without permission. What I'm about to reveal isn't a justification for becoming antisocial or an excuse to avoid responsibility. This is about understanding why some of history's most profound insights have consistently emerged from minds that had the courage to completely separate themselves from social influence, and why this separation reveals a form of intelligence that social thinking cannot produce. Schopenhauer wrote, "The man who does not read lives only one life, but the reader lives thousands." But what he really meant was something much darker. The moment you allow others to define what thoughts are acceptable, what questions are worth asking, or what truths are safe to pursue, you've traded your intellectual potential for social comfort. If you want to understand why isolation might be the highest form of intellectual courage, and why choosing to be completely alone could be the smartest decision you ever make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the philosophical insights that reveal hidden truths about consciousness and human potential. The people who choose isolation haven't given up on understanding the world. They've simply realized that most of what passes for intellectual discourse is actually sophisticated forms of group censorship, where ideas are evaluated not by their truth value, but by their social acceptability, and where the pressure to maintain relationships prevents anyone from pursuing thoughts to their logical conclusions. This isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting all human contact. This is about understanding why the highest forms of human insight often require the courage to be completely intellectually alone. First insight. Schopenhauer understood that intelligent people choose isolation because they've recognized what he called the tyranny of consensus as the death of original thought. Most people don't realize how much their thinking is constrained by invisible social boundaries. Their willingness to consider certain ideas, their ability to question fundamental assumptions, even their capacity to observe reality clearly, is constantly being filtered through the need to maintain social acceptance. But truly intelligent people have made a terrifying discovery. The moment you care about what others think of your ideas, you're no longer thinking freely. You're thinking within the boundaries of what your social group considers reasonable, acceptable, or safe. This isn't just about controversial topics. This applies to every aspect of intellectual exploration. Schopenhauer realized that most people never access their full intellectual potential because they're never alone long enough to think thoughts that might disturb others. They move from conversations to meetings to social media to entertainment, constantly surrounded by other people's opinions, expectations, and emotional reactions. The intelligent person who chooses isolation has made a radical calculation. They've decided that intellectual freedom is more valuable than social approval. They've realized that their most important insights will come not from discussions with others, but from the quiet depths of sustained, solitary reflection, where they can follow ideas wherever they lead, without worrying about offending, confusing, or alienating anyone. This doesn't mean they hate people or can't communicate effectively. It means they understand that original thinking requires conditions that social interaction systematically destroys. They need space to think thoughts that have never been thought, to question assumptions that everyone takes for granted, to explore possibilities that social consensus would immediately reject. Watch how truly intelligent people handle group conversations. They often seem detached, not because they're not listening, but because they're observing how group dynamics systematically eliminate certain types of thinking. They've learned that the price of intellectual conformity is the death of intellectual courage. Second insight. They've mastered what Schopenhauer called the cultivation of inner worlds, which requires developing the capacity to find infinite fascination within their own consciousness without needing external validation or stimulation. There's a profound difference between someone who is isolated because they can't handle social complexity and someone who chooses isolation because they've discovered that their own mind, properly developed, offers richer experiences than most social interactions. Schopenhauer spent his life developing what he called the world as will and representation, the ability to explore philosophical questions, aesthetic experiences, and intellectual problems with a depth and intensity that requires complete freedom from social distraction. He didn't need constant conversation or entertainment because he had learned to find unlimited interest in the workings of consciousness itself. This capacity terrifies people who have never developed intellectual independence. They can't imagine being alone for extended periods because when they're alone, they're confronted with the emptiness of their inner lives. They've never learned to enjoy their own thoughts because they've never taken the time to develop thoughts worth enjoying. But intelligent people who choose isolation have discovered something remarkable. They've realized that their own consciousness, when properly cultivated through reading, thinking, and creative work, becomes more interesting than most conversations, more engaging than most entertainment, more rewarding than most social activities. This doesn't happen accidentally. It requires what Schopenhauer called intellectual discipline, the willingness to spend years developing your capacity for sustained thinking, deep reading, systematic exploration of complex ideas, and creative expression that emerges from genuine internal motivation rather than external pressure. They've transformed their isolation into a laboratory for consciousness, where they can experiment with ideas, explore philosophical questions, and develop insights that would be impossible in social settings. They can spend days following a single line of thought, weeks developing understanding that can't be easily explained to others, months creating work that emerges from their deepest intellectual interests. The person who chooses isolation from this place of inner development appears mysterious or even threatening to people who can't imagine being alone without feeling empty. Their contentment in isolation challenges the fundamental assumption that human fulfillment requires constant social interaction and external validation. Third insight, Schopenhauer recognized that isolated intelligent people develop what he called philosophical immunity, the ability to perceive reality without the distorting influence of social narratives, group emotions, or collective delusions. Most breakthrough insights in human understanding come from individuals who are willing to isolate themselves completely from prevailing social beliefs and observe reality with fresh eyes. When you're constantly surrounded by other people, you're constantly influenced by their assumptions about what's true, possible, or important. Even the most open-minded, intelligent people in your life still represent limitations on your thinking because their presence activates your social conditioning and prevents you from exploring certain territories of thought. But in complete isolation, your mind can observe patterns that social thinking never notices. You can question assumptions that everyone takes for granted. You can see through narratives that seem obviously true to people embedded in social systems. You can recognize the difference between what's actually happening and what people believe is happening. This is where revolutionary insights emerge, not from collaboration or group brainstorming, but from individual minds that have had the time and space to think beyond the boundaries of social consensus. Darwin's theory of evolution, Schopenhauer's philosophy of will, Nietzsche's critique of morality, all emerged from prolonged periods of intellectual isolation. The intelligent person who chooses isolation understands that their most valuable contributions will come from insights that could never emerge from group thinking. They're protecting the conditions that allow for observations that challenge fundamental assumptions, ideas that reveal hidden patterns, understanding that emerges from complete intellectual independence. This requires tremendous courage because you're venturing into mental territory where you have no social support, no way to check your thinking against others, no external validation for the value of your explorations. But intelligent people who choose isolation have developed tolerance for intellectual uncertainty because they understand it's the price of genuine discovery. They're not trying to escape reality. They're trying to see reality more clearly than social participation allows. They understand that the most important truths are often the ones that social groups are psychologically motivated to avoid. Fourth insight, they've understood what Schopenhauer called the economics of consciousness, recognizing that mental energy is finite and that social interaction, regardless of its quality, consumes cognitive resources in ways that prevent deep thinking and creative work. Every social interaction requires you to process not just information, but complex social dynamics, emotional states, unspoken agendas, and interpersonal calculations that drain mental energy. Intelligent people who choose isolation have calculated the cognitive cost of social engagement and decided that much of it represents a poor return on investment of their mental resources. They've realized that they have limited attention and intellectual energy each day, and they want to spend it on thinking, learning, creating, and understanding, rather than on managing social relationships that don't contribute substantially to their intellectual development. This appears selfish until you understand what they're protecting: their capacity for sustained concentration, their ability to think systematically about complex problems, their creative potential. These are the tools they use to generate insights and create work that can benefit others, and they've recognized that these capacities are degraded by too much social interaction. They might maintain one or two relationships with people who understand and respect their need for isolation, but they've eliminated the energy drain of casual socializing, networking, social obligations, and group activities that most people consider normal and necessary parts of life. Schopenhauer himself was notorious for this. He would structure his entire day around protecting his mental energy for philosophical work. He ate alone, walked alone, and avoided social gatherings. People considered him strange or antisocial, but his intellectual productivity was extraordinary because he had preserved his cognitive resources for what mattered most to him. The intelligent person who chooses isolation has made a strategic decision about consciousness itself. They've decided that depth of thinking is more valuable than breadth of social connection, that intellectual achievement justifies social sacrifice, that the ability to contribute something original to human understanding is worth the price of appearing odd or antisocial to others. They understand that most people scatter their mental energy across dozens of social interactions and obligations, never developing the sustained focus necessary for deep thinking or significant creative work. They've chosen a different path, concentrating their intellectual resources on pursuits that require the kind of mental clarity that only isolation can provide. Fifth insight, Schopenhauer understood that people who choose isolation often develop what he called metaphysical vision, the ability to perceive the underlying structures of reality that remain invisible to people, caught up in social systems and cultural narratives. When you step completely outside social participation, you begin to observe human behavior and social structures from an almost anthropological perspective. You notice how much of what people consider meaningful or important is actually arbitrary cultural construction. You observe how social dynamics repeat the same patterns across different contexts and historical periods. You begin to understand the psychological and biological drives that motivate most human behavior, drives that remain unconscious to people embedded in social systems. This understanding can be both liberating and profoundly isolating. Intelligent people who choose isolation often develop what appears to others as detached perspective on human affairs. They can see the games people play, the illusions they maintain, the fears and desires that drive social behavior, but they can no longer participate unconsciously in these dynamics. Schopenhauer wrote extensively about what he called the will to live, the unconscious drive that motivates most human activity. People who choose isolation often do so because they've developed enough philosophical perspective to see through the illusions that make social participation emotionally satisfying, and they find it exhausting to pretend that social conventions and cultural priorities are as meaningful as everyone pretends they are. This doesn't make them superior to others, but it does make them fundamentally different. They've traded social ease for metaphysical clarity, emotional comfort for intellectual honesty, the warmth of belonging for the clarity of independent perception. They can still engage with society when necessary, but they do so as conscious observers rather than unconscious participants. They understand social dynamics well enough to navigate them effectively, but they're no longer emotionally invested in social outcomes because they've seen through the psychological mechanisms that make social validation feel important. This perspective allows them to contribute to human understanding in ways that socially embedded people cannot. They can observe patterns that participants cannot see, question assumptions that insiders cannot challenge, offer insights that emerge only from the perspective of complete intellectual independence. And here we arrive at Schopenhauer's darkest secret about the intelligence of people who choose isolation. They haven't rejected humanity or given up on contributing to human welfare. They've simply recognized that their greatest contributions will come not from social participation, but from the insights that emerge only in complete intellectual solitude. Isolation isn't escape from the world. It's preparation for understanding the world at a level that social participation makes impossible. The isolated intelligence doesn't withdraw from human problems. It develops the perspective necessary to see solutions that socially conditioned thinking cannot generate. Schopenhauer believed that the people who choose isolation are often the ones who care most deeply about human suffering and human potential, precisely because they've had the intellectual space to understand both more clearly than people caught up in social systems can manage. They're not running away from engagement with life. They're developing the intellectual independence necessary to engage with life's deepest questions without the distorting influence of social pressure, group emotion, or cultural conditioning. This is what makes their intelligence truly disturbing to most people. They've discovered that the mind in isolation becomes capable of perceptions and insights that social thinking cannot produce. They've learned that intellectual courage requires the willingness to be completely alone with your own consciousness, regardless of how strange this makes you appear to others. The person who chooses isolation isn't antisocial or afraid of connection. They've simply realized that the highest forms of human understanding require conditions that social life systematically prevents. They've decided that this understanding is valuable enough to justify the apparent strangeness of choosing to be completely alone. This is Schopenhauer's dark secret. The most intelligent people don't choose isolation because they can't handle social complexity. They choose it because they've recognized that social complexity prevents access to forms of intelligence that humanity desperately needs, but that can only emerge in the profound silence of a mind that has learned to think without asking permission from anyone else. The next time you encounter someone who seems genuinely content to be completely alone, who doesn't need social validation or constant interaction, who appears to find unlimited fascination in their own inner world, remember Schopenhauer's insight. You might be in the presence of someone who has discovered forms of intelligence that social thinking cannot generate, insights that arise only in isolation, and understanding that develops only when consciousness is completely free from social influence. They're not running away from intelligence. They're protecting the conditions that allow intelligence to flourish in ways that social participation makes impossible, and what they discover in that isolation might be exactly what the world needs, even if the world isn't ready to understand it.